Kumlen in Ablat Gemara, we are up to Daf Yud Amud Aleph in the Masechta Moed Katan, at the very top of the page, Mitzvah Shabbos, Parshas Yisrei. So this is focusing on the Mishnah. The Mishnah has talked about if you're allowed to marry, if you're allowed to mix two simchas together on Yom Tov Chol Hamoed, and then we spoke about certain activities. I mean, the whole Masechta is about working. The whole first part of the Masechta is about working in Chol Hamoed. So we're talking about that the Mishnah said that an ordinary person can sew on Chol Hamoed, but a professional should do it with a shinui. And we use the word machli, which Gemara will explain in a minute what that means. And and then we spoke about if you're allowed to make a bed is made up of ropes. If you're allowed to actually put a bed together and weave the ropes together. And Rabbi Yosi says mematchin, which we'll see in the Gemara now what that means as well. The Gemara begins at the very top of the page. A hedjed teva kedarka, an ordinary person weaves normally. Heichi domi hedjed. What's the definition of an ordinary person? Amar dvei Rabbi Yana. Rabbi Yana said, Shiva Rabbi Yana said, Kol she'eino yochol loheitzi meloi mached b'vasachel. Who's considered an ordinary person when it comes to sewing? Somebody who does not know how to. A professional can put a bunch of different stitches through, put the thread through the whatever that is sewing together, and gives one yank, and it all becomes smooth and perfect. An ordinary person, non-professional, sits there and sews all the time, in and out, in and out, in and out. That's a definition or the distinction between a professional and an amateur. Rabbi Yosi, so an amateur can continue sewing normally on Chol Hamoed. If he wants to make a hem on the bottom of his dress, and he doesn't, if he sews it on, it's not perfectly straight, then that's an amateur. A professional, you can't even tell it forms part of the dress. So what do we say here? We say that an amateur can sew regularly on Chol Hamoed, but an umen, a professional, can only do machli. What exactly is machli? My machli, what is machli? Rabbi Yechon said you skip every second stitch. So therefore he spreads them out a bit, like the teeth of a dog that are separated. And Rabbi Shmuel Amar shine kalba. So the teeth of a dog, you have the upper layer and the lower layer. They're not directly corresponding to each other. So you have one higher, one lower, one higher, one lower. So the professional makes a shini, doesn't make a straight line, it goes a little higher, some a little bit lower. That's the shini. Then we discussed misargin as hamitas. The Mishnah says that you're permitted to be misarig the beds, which we translated as the ropes. You have a rope ropes that go vertical and ropes that go horizontal, and the one horizontal you weave into the ropes that are going vertical, and that's how you have your bed. That's how we said misagin is. We'll soon see the Gemara. And Rabbi Yosi says no. He says mematchin. In our version he says no. I disagree. Other versions are different, but in our version of Mishnah he says no. I disagree. All you can do is mematchin. Generally speaking, mematchin means to stretch out. What exactly does that mean when it comes to a bed? So the Gemara will explain. My misargin, my memachin. What's going on here? What does it mean? There's actually a discussion between Rabbi Chia bar Abba and Rabasi. Tarvayu, both of them, mashmei the Chizkei Rabbi Yechon. They're both saying in the name of Chizkei and Rabbi Yechon. And the argument is as follows. Chad Amar, one of them says misargin, that the Tana who says you permitted to be misarag a bed means shasi ve'eded. You can put both ropes, the vertical ropes, and then the ones that you weave in the horizontal ones. Umematchin means, and Rabbi Yosi said no, that all you're permitted to do is a matchin means you can do only one. Shasi b'la'eded. You can put the ropes lengthwise, but you cannot put it in widthwise because that's completion of the job. And he doesn't want you to do that. You're creating a whole bed on Chol Hamoed. The Chadam, and the other view is misargin, that the first Tana permits you to be misarg is more limited. It's shasi b'la'eded, is the vertical ropes and not the horizontal. Umematchin, and what's mematchin? You cannot put any ropes, horizontal or vertical. But if the ropes were not taut, you're allowed to tighten them and make them tighter because they're already there. It's not a big effort to just tighten them up. Says the Gemara, and that's the argument in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, it's not so. But Tani Rav Tavchlifa bar Shaul, Rav Tavchlifa the son of Shaul said v'shoving, but everyone agrees she'ein mavshilin chavolin, but to go ahead and to spin the ropes, to create the ropes in the first instance, that you cannot do. Now, If you follow the first interpretation, that the first Tana, the Mishnah says you're allowed to take the existing ropes and you're allowed to weave them together and build the bed, construct the bed. I understand, but to create the ropes, you can't. That's a step removed. That's too far away. So it makes sense what you're saying. And matchin means the vertical without the weaving. Then hainu the tanya of tachlifa shall make sense what tachlifa says. Vishavin that everyone agrees she'ein mafshim chavon lechatchila. But everyone agrees that you're not allowed to go and create the ropes in the first instance. But the view that says that even Mesargin is limited to only the vertical ropes without the horizontal. That means even if the ropes are existing, you're not allowed to construct a bed and put the vertical ropes and then weave through the horizontal ropes. Then of course you're not allowed to create the ropes. Why do you need even to tell me that? Mesargin is shesibala eight of the vertical ropes are the horizontal, and Matchin means im hayiraf they were loose. You would tighten it. Now that you're telling me the horizontal vertical, you're telling me you're not allowed to. You got to tell me not to create the ropes. Of course, it seems to be totally unnecessary. Kasha, you have a problem, but that's not going to deter me and cause me to change my mind. Says Nachman, the son of Yitzchak, to Rabchi, the son of Avin. Is there a view that says that Mesargin? You said that the second opinion is that Mesargin means vertical without horizontal. Is there such a view that Mesargin means the vertical ropes without the horizontal ropes? But now we learned Rameya says, when does the bed have the halachic status of a bed when it comes to the laws of tumah? If you have a couple of mattresses, or if you're sitting on the bed, the whole bed becomes tameh. It takes on the same level of tumah as the person who sat on the zav or the zav sat on it. And he says, what is considered a bed? As soon as you put 3 stitches there, you have the horizontal rope, and then you weave 3 stitches of the vertical rope, then it has a status of a bed. So clearly we see that the word yisroid is only if you have horizontal and vertical ropes, not just vertical ropes on its own doesn't do anything. You can fall right through the ropes. You need the horizontal ropes to convert it into a bed. So how can anybody tell me that Mesargin mean just putting on the vertical ropes? Eliki Yasaravin, when Rabbi came along, he said, the Misragin Kuliyam, you're right. The first view in our Mishnah that says that you're allowed to make the constructed bed, and he uses the word Mesargin, he meant the Shiva Eid. You could construct a complete bed, the vertical ropes as well as the horizontal ropes. Eliki Pligi, what are they arguing? The two of Amoraim that are arguing in the beginning of this Gemara here are arguing, what does mematch mean? What does Rabbi Yossi mean when he says the word you're permitted only to be mematch? What did he mean by that? And that's where Rabbi Bar Abba Rav Asi are arguing. Marsav, one opinion says Rabbi Yossi holds you're also allowed to put ropes, but only the vertical ropes. That mematchin should see the vertical without the horizontal. Marsav, the other says even that you're not allowed to do. But what can you do if the ropes are already existing, pre-existing? You just that they are loose, then mematcha you can tighten them. Meisve, I'll ask you a question. It says in the Brisa, Mesargin is admitted, you're allowed to be Mesaring the Mitta, the Ein Tzorich Leimen. I don't have to tell you, Shemematcha, surely you're allowed to be Mematcha. Okay. Divrei Rameir. So Rameir holds you allowed to do everything to a bed. Rabbi Yossi says, Mematchin, all you can do is Mematch, which we just said means tightening it. Avalai Mesagin, but you're not allowed to weave the ins and outs, the horizontal and the vertical. The yesh, I mean, there's a third opinion. You're not allowed to even tighten the ropes. Or you're not allowed to be a match. Now we're going to analyze the word match. Match means you're putting on the vertical ropes, but not the horizontals. We can understand that third view that says don't even be matech. Okay, it looks like you're constructing a bed. I don't want you to do that on the Talmud. It came along this view of Yeshayim. Leflugi to argue. The one who says the one who says that all it means is that if it's loose, you're allowed to tighten it. Why would anybody say, I'll do that? How can you say that you cannot tighten it? What's the big deal? What are you doing? Why shouldn't you be able to be tightened the rope? Why would anybody say you cannot be tightened the ropes? Says the Gemara, yes, there is such a view they know how to tighten the ropes, and there's a good reason for it. And what is that reason? Because there's an alternative without having to deal with the ropes. You can fill up all the cavities, all the spaces with cushions and mattresses and other things that loitachin, and maybe that's easier to do than to tighten the ropes. And we try to reduce effort on chalamoid. So therefore, that opinion says you're not allowed to even be mateh. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah. The Mishnah of Yuram al says the Mishnah. Ma'amidin, we're still discussing chalamoid. Ma'amidin tanur v'kerayim. You're allowed to set up an oven and a stove. The difference between an oven and a stove, even though Rashi says here one thing, everywhere else he says the other way around, so maybe there's a mistake in Rashi, like the Bach wants to say. A tanner generally was like a funnel. It was very narrow on top, and then it widened on the bottom, and heat therefore was contained and was very, very strong. And the kirayim is like a box, and it has place there for two pots on top, and therefore it's not so hot. And you're allowed to set them up on chalamoid. Now, setting up, according to many Rishonim, is literally, in those days, the ovens were portable. So you're allowed to put them in and pivot them somewhere that they should be permanent over Yom Tov. But Rashi says, he goes further. He says you're allowed to actually construct these ovens because it's necessary for Yom Tov. You need to cook, you need to bake. So you're allowed to do them on L'chatchila, you're allowed to go ahead. And Rechayim, and also a mill. You're allowed to set up a mill, the Moed and Chalamoid. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein mechapshin eserachayim b'tchila. Rabbi Yehuda says, you're not allowed to be mechabish this mill. Now, what in the world is mechabish? What's he talking about? The Gemara is going to explain soon. Says the Gemara, my mechapshin. What exactly does it mean when Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed to be mechabish? What's he talking about? Rabbi Yehuda, so we have now two Amoraim. This is not the same. In the Mishnah, it's Rebbe Yehuda. He's a Tana. In the Gemara, it's Rav Yehuda. He's an Amora. And Rabbi Yehuda, who was the second generation of Amoraim, says, you know what it means? He's talking about menacher rechaya, that a mill has these, these. What happens is that the grains or the kernels, there are holes in there, and then on the rock, and the kernels gets in the top rock, and the kernels get stuck in that holes. And as you turn the top rock over the bottom rock, it breaks these kernels. It breaks them. But what happens is that these holes are no longer deep anymore. They get worn out. So he says over here that you're allowed to, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're not allowed to make these holes on the chalamoid. It's a big job. It's a big job. Rabbi Chil says no. It's talking about bas ina. Every mill has a hole in the middle where you capture the broken kernels, and that's called a bas ina, like the eye. It's right in the middle, and you're not allowed to do that. It's a big effort. You're not allowed to do that on chalamoid according to Rabbi Yehuda. But according to the Kama, it would seem l'chatchila you can even build the whole mill. It says a question. It says ma'amidin tanur v'kerayim b'moed. It says in the Braisa you're allowed to set up a tanur, an oven, and a stove on chalamoid ubelvad, provided shelo yigmay melachta. You don't finish the job. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Chachamim come along and say, Af Yigma, you're permitted to complete the job. You can finish the oven on chalamoid. Rabbi Yehuda says Mishmoy. Rabbi Yehuda says name of Rabbi Eliezer. Ma'amidin esa chadasha. He says when it comes to a new one, you're allowed to set it up. Umechapshin esa yishana. But an old oven, he's explaining Rabbi Eliezer opinion. But an old oven, you're actually allowed to. The teeth are there already, or the holes are there already, but they're a bit worn out, so you have to just fix it up a little bit. That you could do an old one, but a brand new one to make those holes you cannot. It's a big effort. The Yesh, I remember, there's a fourth opinion that says Ein Mechapshi. Now I'll do that at all. Now, Kolika. Now we're trying to understand the word Mechapshi, because there's one opinion that says you cannot do it at all, and Rabbi Yehuda says you could do an old one versus a new one. Mechapshi means Menakere means I want making those teeth. Then Haydn Mishkach will be Shana. So an old one has it, that's worn out. So therefore he says, look, an old one is a small job you could do. A new one is brand new, you cannot go ahead and make those holes. I understand. And the Manda Basina, we're talking about the hole where they all get trapped in there. If it's the hole they will get trapped in there, it's right in the epicenter of this mill. That's where the grains fall in. Well, if it's an old one, obviously it must have this hole already existing. So what does it mean you're allowed to create a bas ina? Bas ina yishana, bas ina lamala. Why would you have to make another one if it's an old one existing? If it's an existing mill, and obviously the whole purpose of the mill is to be able to break the grains over there, the kernels, and get the grains. If that's what it's all about, obviously you already have that bas inner. So what does Rabbi Yehuda say you're allowed to do that on an old one? Says he wants not a problem. Of course, you have a hole. We're talking about the case you want to widen, broaden that hole, expand that hole. And the question is, can you do the chalamoid? You would say you cannot. Says he want further. Once for this person become going ahead. And he was making these holes. Now, Rabbi Yehuda didn't bother to find out, was it a new one that Rabbi Yehuda says you're not allowed to, or was it an old one Rabbi Yehuda says you are allowed to? The Tanna Kama says in all cases you're allowed to, and yet Rabbi Yehuda chastised that person. Furthermore, Omar, Rabbi Yehuda even cursed him. He said, Man hai, who is this person? Ischil Gufa, he desecrated his own personal body, he did a sin. That he desecrated Chalamayid because he went ahead and he made those teeth on the mill and he didn't bother to finding out was it an old one, is he allowed to, or a new one. So the reason why I'm going to curse him out was because he follows the last opinion, the Yesh Omer, who say that is totally forbidden. He held us talking about making teeth, and the Yesh Omer say you're not allowed to do it, doesn't make a difference on old or new, you cannot do the Chalamayid, it's too big of a job. That you're permitted to go ahead and make this whole chalamayid. You're allowed to. He said you're allowed to go ahead and make these holes of chalamayid because he follows, and again makes no difference a new one or an old one. So he follows the Tanna Kama. He follows the first opinion. Mishum Rameir Amar, the name of Rameir, he said, Afilu sus shereichiv Allah, even the horse that you ride, Chameir shereichiv mutel little tzipornayim b'chayla shemayid. A horse that you need a chalamayid, but in order to, you have to groom the horse and you have to work on its hooves and cut its nails. You're allowed to cut its nails, otherwise it's very difficult for it to travel. And Taisa says here on the bottom, that it seems only because you need the horse to benefit you a chalamayid, but to go horseback riding, he says you're not allowed to go horseback riding a chalamayid. And it's all the Taisan here learning that everything that we're doing on this page is all because it's necessary chalamayid. You need it now, not because you're preparing for post chalamayid. Everything what made you do here, in all opinions, is because you need a chalamayid. But interesting, Taisan comes along and bans horseback riding a chalamayid. Then he continues. But a donkey. In those days, for mills, they didn't have the water mills. They had a donkey who used to be tied to the stone and used to walk around and around and around, and used to break, and churn everything there. Like to cut the nails of a donkey, you're not allowed to because it's not that important. For a couple of days, you can have long nails, and it's not going too far. Rabbi Yehuda permitted he permitted actually to remove the nails of these donkeys of the mill, and he also allowed to. He went further. Now we're going to learn a number of laws to do with chalamayid or instances of chalamayid. So basically, a set of halachas now. So he said you're allowed to place. The Chaim is made up of two stones. You're allowed to place the top stone on the bottom stone. You're allowed to do that. To build the millstone, you're allowed to. You're allowed to build the rechayim is supported by a piece of wood, a log that goes across. You're allowed to put that log in. He allowed him to build a barn for your cattle, because all of these things are necessary for chalamayid. Shadi also Rava permitted l'sruke or Rav permitted l'sruke susya to go ahead and comb a horse with metal combs, even though as a result of that you're pulling out hairs, but it's unintentional, and therefore the main thing is you want the horse to look groomed because you're riding in a chalamayid for whatever benefit for chalamayid, so therefore you allow it to look like a mensch. And he also allowed l'mivne akafita. He allowed them to you're allowed to build like a little trough. Or a little box to put the food to feed your horse with. You're allowed to have that to happen. And to build a building made out of stones, to build out of stones, or stools, I would say, to build out of stones. So it's not cement or anything else. So it's not such a big job, and it's necessary. Shara lemishkol domel behema. Rava shara lemishkol domel behema b'chol moed. Rava allowed them to extract blood or to let blood on an animal in chol moed, and because it's for medicinal purposes. Amalei Abaye said, Tanya de Misayelach, I actually have a brisa that supports you. It says, Makizin dam lemehema, you're allowed to let blood for an animal. Be'ein meinin refuah lebehema b'chol moed. And on chol moed, you don't deny an animal any medicines, you're allowed to give medicine. In fact, even on Shabbos, when we don't take medicines, you're allowed to give an animal kontimeni. Rava Shadi, Rava allowed lichesuche kirti. He allowed them to iron and to press the clothing. My time, why? Because Maisa had them. It's not a professional way of doing it, and the chalamayid, an amateur can do that because it's not a professional job. But let's say if you did it with some kind of a soap, or if you did certain parts that you had, it required a professional kind of ironing, then it's forbidden. My time of Maisa Umanu, that's considered a professional. There's different opinions as to what exactly it is, but any kind of ironing that is not from an ordinary person, you need a professional, you cannot do.
Sorry, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why aren't we worried on Shabbos about the Gzeda of Shchikas Samamonim for animals?
Because it seems, since the whole thing is also the Rabban never made an Isser. When they made the Isser, they only applied it to men. Not everyone agrees, by the way, regarding animals, but most poskim hold you allowed to, because they say when the Isser was made, it was made for people and not for and not for animals. So never included in the Isser. Amar says Rabba. Man the maskil, others say kotzab alachai might be mahatera, and if an animal therefore needs its thing, otherwise you'll be over nisr the if it needs its medicine. And it's only Gzeidah Rabbanon, so we don't want to put it in the place of doing an nisr the Torah. Amar Rava said, man de maskil ara. He says over here, if somebody goes ahead and removes stones or things from the ground that don't belong there. So it depends why you're doing it. If you're doing a daita, the Beit Dori doing, you want to build a granary, you want to build a threshing floor, shadi, you're allowed to. But a daita dari, doing it to improve the land on Chalamoid, also we said before, the only thing you're allowed to do on land is something which is, if it's a loss, if you don't do it straight away, and very little tirch. And here, this can wait. How in the world, in other words, what we are worried now, we're saying here is that if it's apparent that you're doing it for a threshing floor, that's all right. If the parent you're doing it to improve the ground in order to plant, it's forbidden. No, it's maris ayin. So what is it? What is the telltale signs for us to know what it is? The Gemara, heichi dummy, what is it? So it's called, this is how Rashi learns the Gemara. Mulya b'mulya. If you put, let's say, if there was a little mound of a pile of something, and then you take the sand from there, you put it on top of another pile. That's called mulya, a filled place on a filled place. Or v'notza b'notza. Let's say it's a low place, it's already a depression there in the ground is very low. And then you place the sand in another low place. So then it's clearly, you're doing it, in other words, you're doing it adaita the ara. I'm quoting the way Rashi learns, which is different than Gemara. Then you're doing it to benefit the ground. You want everything around it to be the same. But mulya, v'shadya b'notza, if you take from a mound and you put it into a hole, then adai to the Beit Dori, then clearly you're not planning to plant, you're just using it as a threshing floor and you're trying to make way, you don't care where the sand ends up. Hi man the zochi zicha. If somebody is taking away twigs and other things from the ground, so he says over here, adai to the tzivik, you're doing it because you want the wood, the branches, the shadi. Adai to that, you're doing it to improve the ground so that you can plant it. Also, it's forbidden. How can we tell? Hey, Chidomi, Shakal Rabbi took only the big branches, the shavigs that you left of the small ones. That's clear. You try to make a fire. Adai to the tzivik, you want the wood for firewood. You took everything away. You're clearing the whole ground, and obviously you're trying to benefit the ground. Adai to that, and that is forbidden. If let's say you have a river next to you, and then you have a little pond that you built, and you allow the water from the river to go in the pond, and now the question is the purpose to catch the fish? You want the fish from the river to go into the pond, and then you clear out the water and you'll catch all the fish, or the purpose is because you want to irrigate your field. So this is again the telltale sign. Hi, demand the Pasach Mayla Ara. If somebody opens, let's say, the entrance from the river into his pond, and then adai to the kivreim. If he does it in order to catch the fish, shad is permitted. Adai to the ad. If he does it in order to irrigate his land, also is forbidden. Hey, chidami, how can we tell? Again, Pasach Trei Bobby. You open up two holes to the river, and one hole is from the river entering this little pond that you built. And the idea is obviously of the water, the fish will come in there. And then the other one is you make another hole so the water should be able to escape, but not big enough for the fish to escape. So therefore it's clear what you're trying to do is trap the fish. Either water's going on your field and you're irrigating it, but that's not your intent. Your intent is to trap the fish, and you're allowed to. And then it's clear, everybody can see that. There's no maris ein here. So again, Pasach Trei Babi Chadmi Loy v'Chadmi Toy. One hole above and one hole below is a dai to the kivre. One hole is to bring everything into the pond. The other hole is the water to escape, and the fish should be trapped. Pasach Chad Baba. If you only open one hole for the water to come in with the fish, and then what happens? As the pond fills up, finally it's filled to the top. It overflows, and all that excess water goes and covers your field. You're not interested in the fish. You're interested in irrigating your field, and that's forbidden. A dai to the ada. That's forbidden. V'amar says Rava. Hi man the posher dikla. If somebody's cutting off branches from a palm tree, and you're pruning a palm tree, is a daita the you're doing it in order to feed your animal because they used to eat parts of the palm tree. Sure, it's all right. A daita the dikla, we're doing it in order to prune and to make to preserve the tree. Also, you're now doing a chalamoid. Again, how can we tell? Shakul kulam echad gisa. If you only cut off one side of the tree, that means you're not really concerned about the wealth of the tree itself. A daita the chiyusa. Then obviously you're doing it purely to feed your animals, and you don't care what branch you're taking off, as long as you give it to your animals. However, the mechaygis, you're cutting off some of this side and that side, and you're choosing at which branches you're taking off. Obviously, you're taking off the dry ones, and you're letting the moist ones stay because you want to preserve the tree. Then a dai to the dikla, you're doing it for the tree's sake, but also it's a bit. Rava says, Rava, Hani Tamri Tuchoni, he says, these dates that are unripe, Migzerinu, if you go ahead and you cut them into two in order to eat them on Yom Tov, you're allowed to. But if you're cutting it in order to let it dry, then it is forbidden. In other words, you want all the moisture to come out so that it can sit there and dry. It's forbidden because the purpose is you're not trying to save this. You're trying to turn it in. You're trying to dry it, and you want like raisins or something, and that you're not allowed to do. Because you're doing it for after Sukkot, you're not allowed to do that. Yeah, or what do you call it? We're talking about furthermore. He's talking about even on Yom Tov. In the Rashi said we're talking about actually Yom Tov itself. And if you're cutting it up in order that on Yom Tov you should eat it, then it's all right. But if you're cutting it up on Yom Tov in order that the juice should come out, that it should dry, obviously it takes a few days for it to dry. So you are preparing on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov, and that you're not allowed to do for the weekday. You're not allowed to do that. Says the Gemara. Now, Papa Rambam says, "Kivan the mitzloi." No, he said, since they get ruined if you don't take the water out, is bekrabmatya ha'avadami. It's like a business that if you don't do something about it, you are going to incur a loss, and then you're allowed to do it on chalamoid. On chalamoid, at least you're allowed to do that, even though the dry takes a while, it won't be ready till after Yom Tov. You're allowed to do that on chalamoid, at least on Yom Tov. On chalamoid, you're allowed to do that because we learned before that if you're avoiding a loss, you can do that. Says the Gemara, prakmatya kosher also. Any kind of business, not only labor intensive thing, but business, buying and selling is also forbidden on chalamoid. But if it's something that you're avoiding a loss, you're allowed to. Now, there's a very big machlekes between Rashi and Tais, a very important machlekes. So everyone knows on chalamoid you're allowed to go to work if it's a davar of. If it's something that you incur a loss, you might get you lose your job or in business. Rashi says here that if you will incur a loss, if you don't do it, and let's say business, if you don't do it, you're lost. And Rashi says, but for no reason, the last 5 words of the Rashi, the last line of the pages, he says, I'll just read it to you because it's very important. Aval bechinam, says Rashi, if you do it for no reason, Not even to make a profit, then usher, it is forbidden to go to the store or retail just to open the door and not make a profit. So Rashi clearly says here that if it's not a question of a loss, it's a question of making a profit, you're allowed to do that on Chol Hamoed. That's Rashi. And Tosfos says no. Tosfos in the last page on the page says that V'davra Ovid Mutter is only that if you don't deal with it straight away, you're actually going to lose some of the principle. But if the principle remains intact, it's a question of profit, says Tosfos, that's not called a Dovra Ovid. So it's a big machlekes, Rishonim and Shulchan Aruch is a big machlekes. What is the definition of a Dovra Ovid that we allow you on Chol Hamoed to go ahead and to do work? What's the definition of Dovra Ovid? And others want to say that even if we permit you, Rashi permits over here, that a Dover Ovid is question of profit, it's only when it talks about business. But when it talks about, we learned in the very first mission here, that the only time you're allowed to irrigate a field is that if it has to be a loss, not just a question of profit, but it has to be a loss. Because there's two issues. One is labor and one is business. Business is a distraction. Labor is much more than a distraction. It's sort of Chol Hamoed, it's like Yom Tov. It's not the spirit of Yom Tov at all. So when it comes to labor, then the only time you permit you to do it on Chol Hamoed is that if not, you'll incur an actual loss. When it comes to business, so it's not a question of labor, it's more a question of distraction, then Rashi holds are much more relaxed. And if it's a question of profit, we also allow you to do it on Chol Hamoed. Okay, let's just continue. Says the Gemara, Ravina Habi Masik. Now the Gemara will bring us, the Gemara will bring a story that even though technically you're allowed to work a Chol Hamoed, but if you trust the Eibishter, he'll take care of you even if you don't work. Ravina Havaleahu Iska. Ravina had a business. He had a business that he was able to sell on Chol Hamoed for 6,000 zuz, which is a substantial sum of money. But he decided, I'm not going to do business, even though that buyer was going to go away. And who said I'll get anything afterwards? So it's a question of a dover of it in, not just profit, maybe even loss. He decided to delay the sale, wait till after Chol Hamoed. And then what happened was he got another buyer, he was able to sell for double. So Hashem took care of him because he went beyond the letter of the law, therefore he benefited beyond the norm. Ravina having masik zuzi, Ravina lent money b'bnei Akra de Shavasa to the people of Akra, the river Shavasa. Also, the Kamed Ravashi wanted to know if he can collect his loans. He lent money there to people. It looks like with maybe with interest. He wanted if he can collect his loans on Chol Hamoed. Can I go now and collect my money on Chol Hamoed? Now everybody's home. Most people don't work, so they're home. After Yom Tov, who said you'll find them? It's like a business that you're going to cause a loss, and you are permitted, and therefore you're permitted. So there's the big machlek is if you're allowed to collect, loans or not. The Gemara seems clearly to me that you're allowed to collect loans. So Tosfos brings that Rabbeinu Tam believe that lending money with interest to a non-Jew is not called a business. It's a service. It's like Tosfos is saying a service industry is not a business, and lending is not really a business. So how come our Gemara seems to say that lending money is a business, and our Gemara says the only reason why you're allowed to is because you might not get paid back after Yom Tov. In other words, it really is a business. So how can Rabbeinu Tam says you're allowed to make loans, give loans on Chol Hamoed with interest, when the Gemara clearly says it's only if it's a dover of it, only if there's some kind of a loss if you don't do it. So Rabbeinu Tam says our Gemara is not talking about a loan. Our Gemara is talking about he sold them wine and he was collecting, and as long as they didn't pay, it's a debt. But it's not a debt from a loan; it's a debt from a sale that you made and they haven't paid yet. But loans, and others argue, they say that a loan with interest is considered a business. And the Gemara continues. Tanyanami, we also learn about Avodah Zarah. High Gavla, similarly, that Holchin we can go liyarid shalakum. We literally mentioned before that on the days of the Chag of the Goyim, on their days you shouldn't do business with them because they will go and be thankful. We had this a couple of days ago, Rabbi Yehuda. They'll be thankful that to their gods on account of you. And we don't let that happen. But you're allowed to go to a yarid. A yarid is a market. Interesting that we call a market a yarid because the Gemara sort of looked down on this concept of going to these yarid. Yarid means to go down. they look down on these market days that you have to stop learning and stop doing all your mitzvahs in order to go ahead and do this thing here. So he went to a Yarid of Goyim. The loichim behema, you're allowed to buy animal, avodim, servants, v'shrochas, and maids, botim, sodra, kromim, houses, fields, and vineyards. And the koisev umarle bar shalhen, you're allowed to go ahead to their courts and to sign proper contracts, because if you don't, they're going to renege on their deal, rescind whatever it is, and there's no guarantee you'll get whatever you bought. You're trying to protect your belongings, your assets from them, and you're allowed to do that. So the same thing here. It's like a pragmatia. It's like a business where there's a loss. Rav, might as well go to the Mishnah already. Rav Shara Lechia Barashi. Rav allowed Chia Barashi the Migdal Oyhara. He allowed them to go ahead and to build like fish nets. My time, but why Maisa had you do? It's not really professional, it's an ordinary thing, and you need to catch fish, so you're allowed to. Aval Islay, but to catch a net, to catch birds, that he forbids, because that already requires talent, that's already a professional job, and you shouldn't do that in a chalamoid. My timer Maisa Umanu, that requires a professional work, and you're not allowed to get professional work done. Rabbi Yehuda. And if a professional does it, it has to be done with a shini. Rabbi Yehuda shari la'ami tunara. Rabbi Yehuda allowed Ami, the person who builds ovens, the middle tanure. He allowed him to go ahead and to build a brand new oven, which is the way Rashi learned the Mishnah. Rashi in the Mishnah learned ma'amidin means not just to move something portable, but to actually build it. And therefore, it seems that Rashi holds that's exactly what happened here. And maybe that's how Rashi learns, why Rashi learns Ma'amidin means they built, because in this story here, he allowed him to build an oven. Rabba bar Asbi, and he allowed Rabba bar Asbi the Migdal Moilasa. He allowed him to build a sieve, which you need for the food. They want any, it's not so, but Tony Rabba bar Shmuel v'Shavin, everyone agrees, everyone agrees you're not allowed to build an oven in the first instance. Now, who's this everyone? If you learn like the other Mefarshim that the Mishnah, when they allow ma'amidin, it means only to move a portable oven and to pivot it here somewhere in the house and make it a bit more permanent. But to build one, you're not allowed to. Then it makes sense. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't even allow to fix those holes in there, and the Tanakama allows you to move an oven, but no one says you're allowed to build an oven. But if you learn like Rashi, that ma'amidin means to build an oven, then who is it that we say that everyone agrees that you don't build it? We're trying to talk about it a little bit. Or maybe Rashi got his shot only after the final conclusion of the Gemara, which is in the summertime when it's very dry and doesn't rain at all, you're allowed to make an oven because it'll dry quickly. You'll be able to use it on Yom Tov. If you build an oven the first day Chalamoid, by the second day Chalamoid, you can use it. So therefore, it's for the sake of Yom Tov or Chalamoid, you can do that. When you say not allowed to construct an oven, it's talking about in the winter. Because in the winter, it'll take a week or two before it dries. Like Sukkot time, you cannot do it in a Sukkot because then it's rainy, everything else, and you will not be able to have any benefit from this oven of Chalamoid or on the last days of Sukkot. Therefore, you cannot do that. So that's how we explain this thing here. Okay, everyone have a Shavua Tov, a good Vach.